Have you ever walked into a hotel and felt out of place? A space where you should feel welcome, but instead, you're met with judgment, dismissed before you even speak. Now imagine this isn't just any hotel, but one tied to your identity, your hard work, and your sacrifice. Yet someone turns you away, not knowing who you really are. This isn't just one person's experience. It's a reflection of something bigger, a story about assumptions, resilience, and a reckoning that challenges prejudice and power. Stay with us as we explore this powerful moment of truth. The hotel wasn't just another business. It was a legacy, a staple in the heart of the city. Its reputation stretched far beyond its walls. Known for its elegance and luxury, it attracted an elite clientele, from political figures to Hollywood stars. Its towering facade, the polished marble floors, the gleaming chandeliers, they all spoke of a rich history, of status and power. For years, the hotel had been a symbol of success, not just for its guests, but for the man who owned it, Marcus Walker. Marcus wasn't just an entrepreneur, he was a trailblazer, a self-made businessman who, against all odds, had built this empire. The hotel was the result of years of hard work, perseverance, and an unyielding belief that he could defy expectations. But for all the luxury his hotel represented, there was still something lurking beneath the surface, something he hadn't expected to face, in a place he had worked so hard to create. Enter Jane, the receptionist, young, professional, but with a bias she didn't even know she carried. She had worked at the hotel for several years and had seen countless guests come and go. But when Marcus walked through the door, something about him didn't fit her image of what the hotel's clientele should look like. She didn't know who he was. Instead, she saw him as just another guest, a black man in a place she associated with the wealthy and powerful. To Jane, Marcus didn't belong. Her treatment of him was subtle but telling. An awkward glance, a cool tone, the way she spoke to him as if he were a problem to be dealt with rather than a respected guest. She was unaware that the very man she was dismissing was the one who made the hotel what it was. As Marcus stood at the desk, he could feel the tension building. There was something off, something uncomfortable about the way she was looking at him. It wasn't overt, but it was there. He'd faced prejudice before, but never in a place he owned. He'd worked tirelessly to build this business. And yet, here he was, being treated like he didn't belong. The receptionist's coolness escalated. She started asking questions that felt more like judgment, as if he didn't have the right to be there. The dismissiveness in her voice grew as she tried to check him in, her actions seemingly designed to make him feel small, unimportant. And in that moment, Marcus realized the truth. This wasn't just a mistake. This was something deeper, something ingrained in the way people like Jane saw the world. It wasn't about his status or what he'd achieved. It was about the assumptions she made based on the color of his skin. But Marcus wasn't just any other guest. He was the owner. And this moment, however small it seemed, was about to reveal much more than the prejudice he faced. It was about to reveal the power of identity and how it shapes the way the world sees us. Marcus Walker stepped through the doors of his own hotel. The familiar sounds of the lobby, the soft hum of conversation, the rustle of newspapers, the clink of keys, welcomed him like a well-worn embrace. This was his space, the place he had poured every ounce of his energy into. But as he approached the front desk, something felt different. The receptionist, Jane, sat behind the gleaming counter, her eyes quickly scanning the room. She didn't look up at him immediately. Instead, she continued shuffling papers, her movements mechanical. As Marcus approached, he caught her gaze for the briefest of moments, just long enough to see the subtle shift in her expression, the faintest flicker of hesitation, followed by a practiced smile. "Good evening," she said, her voice polite but cold. Marcus nodded, returning the greeting. He had been here countless times, but this time there was an unease that lingered in the air. It was something unspoken, something that hadn't been there before. He stepped closer, placing his briefcase down on the counter. "I'm here for my room," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm. Jane's fingers hovered over the computer keyboard, eyes flicking between the screen and Marcus. Her fingers tapped lightly on the keys, but her gaze remained distant, detached. She didn't ask for his name or any of the usual questions. Instead, she simply scanned the screen for a moment, as though trying to decide what to do with him. "Do you have a reservation?" she asked, not looking up from the computer. Marcus felt a small twinge of confusion. "I do, Marcus Walker," he replied, speaking slowly to ensure she caught every word. "Under my name." Jane's eyes flicked up from the screen, her gaze cool and appraising. There was a moment of pause, then she returned to the screen, her fingers now typing with a hint of reluctance. She glanced back at him, as if weighing him in some unspoken way. "Mr. Walker, we only have the basic rooms available for tonight," she said, her tone flat. "Would you prefer one of those?" Marcus blinked. A slight ripple of discomfort moved through him, but he controlled it. He was used to navigating moments like this, the subtle insinuations, the silent judgments that so often came with the space he occupied in the world. Still, something about the way she said it stung. "I'm afraid that won't do," Marcus replied, his voice smooth but with an edge of frustration barely concealed. "I'd like a suite." Jane's expression barely shifted. She glanced at him again, then returned to the screen with a quiet sigh. There was a visible flicker of annoyance that crossed her face, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she tapped the keyboard with a bit more force, as if trying to force the computer into submission. "We only have smaller rooms," she repeated, her voice now tinged with a passive dismissal. "Those are the ones we're offering." A knot began to form in Marcus's stomach. He had never encountered this kind of coldness in his own hotel. He had always prided himself on ensuring that everyone, no matter their background, was treated with respect. Yet here he was, standing at the counter, being treated as if he didn't belong. His name was on the building, his vision had created this place, and yet, here he was, being dismissed like just another black man trying to occupy a space he was not welcome in. His mind raced, his initial confusion transforming into something much sharper: hurt, frustration, and, for the first time in a long while, a deep anger. He had worked so hard to rise above the prejudices, to create something that shattered the very assumptions that Jane was making, and yet in the face of it, all that effort seemed invisible. In her eyes, he was still other. "I think you're mistaken," Marcus said, his voice holding a quiet power now. "I own this hotel. I built it. This isn't just any room, it's my space." Jane's eyes flicked up, momentarily wide with surprise. But the moment passed quickly, and her face hardened into a look of indifference. She didn't react in the way Marcus expected. There was no apology, no immediate realization that she had made a mistake. Instead, she remained unyielding, almost as if his claim was a joke to her. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't have anything available for you," she replied coolly. "If you would like, I can direct you to the nearest motel." A shock of disbelief hit Marcus like a wave. His entire body stiffened. He had heard of people being treated unfairly in hotels, of course, but to experience it himself, in the place he had built, his own creation, was another thing entirely. He stood frozen for a moment, unable to believe what he was hearing. "This isn't happening," he thought. "This isn't how it's supposed to be." "Are you asking me to leave?" he said slowly, his voice now tinged with barely contained anger. The words tasted bitter on his tongue, but he had to hear it from her. Jane didn't flinch. Her eyes narrowed, and she didn't so much as blink before she nodded, her lips pressing into a tight line. "Yes, I am. Please leave the premises." The words landed hard. He could feel the weight of them settle deep in his chest. But as he stood there, struggling to make sense of it all, something in him snapped. He had faced this kind of racism before, but never in a place where he was supposed to be in control. Never in a place he had built, his vision, his blood, his sweat. It all seemed meaningless in this moment. He stood there for a long moment, his mind swirling, but then he slowly gathered himself. He looked around at the space he had created, the lobby that had once felt like home, now feeling like a strange, alien place. He didn't need to prove anything to her. His identity, his work, his accomplishments were more than enough to speak for him. And if she couldn't see that, it didn't matter. "I'll leave," he said quietly, turning away from the counter. But just as he reached the door, his phone buzzed. He paused, and with one last glance at Jane, he stepped outside to take the call. As he stood in the parking lot, calling someone he trusted for support, his mind spun. How had he come to this? He had worked his entire life to be where he was, only to be treated like a problem to be dealt with, just because of the color of his skin. Marcus returned to the hotel lobby, his head held high and his demeanor calm. But inside, he was a storm of emotions. The weight of the earlier encounter pressed heavily on his chest. He had decided not to let this moment pass without addressing the injustice he had faced. But how he handled it would determine the impact of the lesson he needed to teach. As he approached the front desk, Jane looked up. Her expression shifted to one of visible discomfort. Word had spread quickly among the staff that the man she had dismissed earlier wasn't just any guest. He was Marcus Walker, the owner of the very hotel she worked in. Her face flushed, her earlier confidence replaced by a nervous, almost panicked energy. Before Marcus could speak, the hotel manager, a middle-aged man with a professional but apologetic demeanor, emerged from a side office. His steps quickened as he approached Marcus. "Mr. Walker," the manager began, his voice trembling slightly. "I cannot express how sorry I am for the misunderstanding earlier. Please, allow me to personally escort you to the VIP suite we've prepared for you." Marcus held up a hand, stopping the manager mid-sentence. His gaze remained fixed on Jane, whose eyes darted to the floor, unable to meet his. "Before we talk about accommodations," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm, "I want to address what happened earlier." The lobby grew quiet. Staff members nearby paused their tasks, their ears tuning into the confrontation. Jane's breathing quickened, and her hands fidgeted at her sides. "Miss," Marcus continued, his tone unwavering, "when I walked in earlier, you didn't just refuse me service. You made assumptions about me. Assumptions based on nothing more than how I look." Jane swallowed hard, but still she didn't speak. The manager shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Marcus and Jane, clearly unsure of how to intervene. Marcus turned to the staff gathered nearby. "Do you all understand what that means? In this hotel, my hotel, we've built a reputation on being inclusive, on treating every guest with dignity and respect. Yet today, I wasn't even given the courtesy of acknowledgement. Instead, I was asked to leave my own property." The gravity of his words hung in the air, the weight of the truth undeniable. Marcus let the silence linger, giving everyone a chance to absorb what he had said. Finally, Jane spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know who you were." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "And that's exactly the problem. You didn't need to know who I was. All you needed to know was that I was a guest, just like anyone else who walks through those doors. But instead, you chose to see me as someone who didn't belong." Jane's face flushed a deeper shade of red, her hands trembling as she finally met his gaze. "I didn't mean—" "No," Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp but controlled. "You didn't mean for me to find out who you thought I was. That's the truth." The staff looked on, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. The hypocrisy of Jane's actions was glaring. The very person she had dismissed as unworthy of service had turned out to be the one who paid her salary. Marcus turned back to the manager. "This isn't just about me. If this is how you treat someone like me, I can only imagine how many others have been turned away or treated poorly simply because they didn't fit your idea of who belongs here." The manager nodded quickly, his face pale. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Walker. I take full responsibility for this, and I'll ensure it never happens again." Marcus wasn't satisfied with empty promises. He took a deep breath, his voice softer now but no less powerful. "This moment isn't about apologies. It's about change. I want every member of this staff to undergo training, real training, on bias and inclusion. Because if we don't address this now, it will happen again." The fallout from the incident spread quickly. Jane was called into a meeting with Marcus and the manager, struggling to justify her actions. Marcus, calm but firm, pointed out that her behavior was unprofessional and based on poor assumptions. He issued a public statement, sparking conversations about accountability in the hospitality industry. The hotel implemented training to improve service quality, and Jane, placed on probation, eventually apologized, acknowledging the harm she caused. Still, Marcus accepted, but emphasized actions over words. The incident became a catalyst for change. Marcus launched initiatives promoting professionalism and equity, turning a difficult moment into a lasting movement for respect and excellence. What would you have done if you were Marcus Walker? How would you have handled being dismissed in a place you built with your own hands? Assumptions and biases can shape how people are treated, often in subtle but impactful ways. How do you think we can address these issues in our daily lives? Share your thoughts and stories below. Together, we can build a world of respect and dignity for all. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story that matters.